everyone, welcome back to Rachel's News, and thank you for joining us once again. I'm here with an incredible guest, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and he is the president of Waterkeepers Alliance. He is an incredible defender of the land, of people, of children. He has dedicated such a huge part of his life to hold corporations accountable, and I'm honored today to have you on the show and to be able to introduce one of Time Magazine's heroes for the planet. So thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
Well, I wanted to just have you and be able to talk about everything that you've been working on, especially in the past couple of years. You focused a lot on the Monsanto Trials. And I was just curious to know, with all of these legal suits and the amount of money that these corporations are having to pay, do you think that this could really put a dent in Bayer's profits or be the end of Bayer?
Well, I think it's having a big dent in Bayer. When we first started the case in June of 2018, we started picking a jury, and at that same time, Bayer was completing the consummation of its merger with Monsanto, its purchase essentially of Monsanto. The price, and which was the best deal in the world from a corporate standpoint, maybe that's ever been done for the Monsanto shareholders. But for Bayer, it's been historically probably one of the worst corporate deals in history. They paid $63 billion for Monsanto. And 5 weeks later, when the judgment came back, Bayer's stock dropped by about 30% and has never recovered. The analysts recently released numbers that show that the total value of Bayer today is around $63 billion. So the entire value of the Monsanto, what was once the Monsanto company, has been erased. So that company now, if the company still existed, it would have zero value. And I would say it's going to ultimately have a negative value. Because, all we're challenging them on is the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cases, but they have a lot of other problems, and the science is maturing on those problems. They have celiac disease, they have non-alcoholic fatty liver cancer, they have all kinds of, weed allergies that have become epidemic now, coterminous with the explosive use of Roundup in the environment. There is a very, very strong scientific track record on kidney disease, including kidney cancers, colon cancers, breast cancers, and a lot of other illnesses that have not reached the point where we pass what we call the Daubert threshold, the point where a judge will actually let you show that science to the jury, but a lot of them are right on the threshold of that. And when that happens, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is just going to be one of many, many problems that Monsanto, now Bayer, has. What's going to happen to Bayer? Well, Bayer is already being broken up. Bayer sold its animal science division a few weeks ago for about $7 billion. And clearly they sold that to help pay for this lawsuit. I don't know whether Bayer will survive as a company. I'm sure the name will survive. But I know the major analysts and some of Bayer's largest shareholders are telling the company now that they need to break up.
Yeah, and it's been having massive effects globally too, not just on Bayer, but we're seeing, country after country is starting to create more strict decisions surrounding Roundup, and some countries, we even see Germany, for instance. Do you think that North America could ever have stricter regulation or bans?
I think that's, ultimately, I think we would be one of the last countries to actually ban Roundup, because our democracy at this point has been so subverted, and EPA is essentially a captive agency. EPA is no longer working for the American public. It's now working for these big chemical companies and the oil interests and some of the other big cartels. So it's very, we haven't banned a we couldn't even ban chlorpyrifos, even though all of the science on chlorpyrifos was that this just is poison and it's destroying our children. So I think the U.S. is a really hard place to get a ban like that. But the thing that we have in this country is we have a unique legal system and we have unique discovery rules. And our discovery rules have allowed us to get millions of pages of documents, including these very, very damning pages, and that show that not only was Monsanto fixing the science, Monsanto knew that that Roundup caused cancer, and they were taking an extraordinary campaign that they mounted to make sure nobody else did science on it, and that the science that was produced was ghostwritten by Monsanto, and Monsanto actually had a toady or a lackey who was running the pesticide division at EPA, a man named Jess Rowland, whose job it was to actively derail scientific studies of the carcinogenicity of Roundup. So, but because of our discovery process here, we've gotten the documents that show that trail of corruption. And those documents are making a big impression on the health ministries around the world who have not been corrupted by the industry.
Right.
So they're getting a hold of those documents and saying, holy cow, this is not what we thought, the American regulatory system was about. And we've got to take care of ourselves, and we've got to take care of our own people. And those governments are actively banning Roundup or making Monsanto label it or increasing restrictions on its use.
It's interesting to me that you mentioned the EPA. The Trump administration has cut a lot of funding to various programs, including that, but has also cut the Endangered Species Protection Act, has allowed for greater inputs of pesticides and herbicides and new genetically modified foods and technologies. How do you think that we can reverse the damage caused by this Trump administration?
Well, it's a mistake to look at the Trump administration as an anomaly. The Trump administration is really just the radical acceleration of a process that's been happening since at least 1980. And we saw the same thing during the Bush administration, where lobbyists were put in charge of all of the agencies of government that regulate the environment: Department of Interior, the EPA, the Department of Commerce, which regulates fisheries, and the other divisions of government that have to do with the environment. But it really began in 1980, and it began with in 1970 we had Earth Day. 20 million Americans came out onto the street because our environment was in shambles. The Cuyahoga River was burning for a week with flames that were 8 stories high that year in '69. The same year, the Santa Barbara oil spill closed all of the beaches of California, cost billions of dollars to those economies. There were tens of thousands of Americans who were dying every year during smog events. The DDT had exterminated the eastern peregrine falcons. And all these environmental insults brought 20 million people out of the street, 10% of our population, the largest public demonstration in American history, demanding that our political system restore to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been the entitlement since the Magna Carta, since the Code of Justinian. And the political system responded. Republicans and Democrats frightened to death of this huge outpouring of democratic power. Passed 28 major environmental laws over the next 11 years, including the ones you mentioned: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, CERCLA, RCRA, Superfund, etc. And those laws were intended to restore the marketplaces and make the markets function rationally, and protect the commons at the same time. Industry reacted, and their first great champion was Ronald Reagan, who came in and not only began dismantling the protections of the Department of Interior. He appointed James Watt to, put our national lands on fire sale, but he brought in to run EPA and Gorsuch. And her specific charge was to destroy the Superfund law. And she got caught making sweetheart deals with a bunch of large chemical corporations. 26 of her deputies ended up being subpoenaed by Congress and either going to jail, including Rita Lavelle, or leaving the agency altogether. But it was the beginning of a backlash where industry began reasserting its control. And the biggest victory for those polluting industries was not on the environmental playing fields, but it was with the Citizens United case in 2008, which was the Supreme Court case that got rid of a 100-year-old law that forbade corporations from giving money to federal political candidates. And that opened a tsunami of wealth that poured into the political process, corrupted our democracy, and ended up getting people like allowing the Koch brothers to put in $1 billion into a single presidential election. And here's something that we know. In about 95% of the political elections over the past 2 decades, the candidate with the most money has won the election. So democracy is for sale. And corporations, for polluters, they have the biggest incentive to buy it. And so, for people like George W. Bush and Donald Trump, it is, they come in and they do what the polluters ask them to do, which is to appoint their cronies and their lobbyists to run these agencies. And Morden Blackwell, who's one of the great, right-wing strategists, often says policy is personnel, that it doesn't matter what the law says. If you're guy administering the law, you can do anything you want. And Donald Trump is is basically the progeny of that corrupted democracy. And there's no way you ask, there's a long roundabout way of answering your question, which is what can we do about it? The only thing that will actually work is to reverse Citizens United and get the money out of politics, because it doesn't matter what law you pass, it doesn't matter who you elect, the polluters are going to still own our government as long as Citizens United is the law of the land.
Right. And I mean, going off of that, corruption has become such a massive conversation that we're having, especially with the elections coming up. And I just wonder, was corruption always that bad? Because I grew up in this age of corruption, of being a young person who is fighting against corporations. And has it increased? Have you noticed that in your lifetime?
Listen, we've always had corruption. It's part of human nature. People are going to try to, take things for free. But we've never seen anything like this, at least since the Gilded Age, when we really lost democracy in this country in the 1890s, where, you had these big trusts, the steel companies, the railroad trust, the sugar trust, that literally owned the state legislatures. And at that time, there was no direct election of senators. The senators were appointed by the legislatures. And they were pawns for these big companies. They were moved around, and America was really, there was very little in the realm of kind of civic responsibility. It really became the robber barons that were raping our country. But in my lifetime, certainly, and I don't think in American history we've ever seen anything like we've seen now. We've really seen the diminishment of our nation. I don't think we can call ourselves an exemplary nation anymore. I don't think we can call ourselves a paradigm. I think people all over the world are horrified about what's happened to our country. The institutions that take generations to build, that safeguard a democracy from corruption, have been deliberately and systematically subverted and eroded and corroded. So not only, the EPA, But, you know, even the courts at some level and the press has certainly been corrupted and is owned by, you know, the big industries. And now we have even the social media, these giant corporations that have so much control over the free flow of information in a democracy are now, you know, aligning themselves and partnering with pharmaceutical companies, which are among the evil, homicidal companies on the globe. So it's hard to see the path out of this.
Right.
I think we really need what we had in 1970, which was a huge outpouring of grassroots activism, is the only way we're going to reclaim our country. You know, something like this did happen in the 1880s and 1890s when the robber barons came in during the Gilded Age. And we were able to reverse course then. And it was a combination of factors that allowed us to get out of that kind of spiral of corruption and tyranny. And the principal forces was there was an urban movement called the Progressive Movement, and there was a rural grassroots movement called populism. And they had really fantastic leaders. And you had those movements, and then you had a very active press. You had muckraking journalists like Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair and Sinclair Lewis, who were going after the oil companies, and you had newspapers who were covering that.
Right.
And then you had a very charismatic leader, Teddy Roosevelt, who was unafraid to challenge the trusts. And what they passed a number of laws that succeeded in restoring our democracy. They passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up these big trusts. They passed for the first time a graduated income tax, which affected not only wealthy people who, for the first time, prior to 1910, if you were a billionaire or a millionaire, there were no billionaires. If you were a millionaire, you paid the same tax as a guy who was, you know, driving a carriage on the street. So after we passed the graduated income tax, the wealthy Americans had to start paying their share of the cost of government. Corporations also were subject to that tax. We passed a 40-hour work week. We gave women the vote. We passed laws that made it legal and beneficial for workers to organize into unions.
Right.
And that counterbalanced some of that power of the corporations over our government. And we passed child labor laws, and the most important law that we passed in 1907 was a law that said that it was illegal for corporations to give money to federal political candidates.
Wow.
And that law stayed in place for 101 years until the Supreme Court, you know, Clarence Thomas and Scalia, threw it in the trash heap of history, and they threw away democracy at the same time.
Right. And so now with this political tension that we're facing, do you have advice for voters going forward in this upcoming election?
I would just say vote for, you know, the most progressive candidates that you can, for people who, I mean, we need somebody like another Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt wasn't all good, by the way. He had a lot of problems. You know, he would, that I don't need to go into, but he was an imperialist and did a lot of bad things internationally, but he had a lot of guts, and he was unafraid. Right. And he stood up to Standard Oil, and he stood up to the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Fricks and all of the big robber barons, and you know, he really restored American democracy. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I mean, I think all of the activists in this movement, too, going forward, we need courageous efforts, and you've been on the forefront of that for so long now.
and you've been attacked a lot for your stance on many different issues, and I've also been personally attacked. When you're going up against corporations, that's what tends to happen. How do you deal with that adversity and opposition?
Well, I just, I feel like, I feel like I'm privileged to be able to be part of a fight that's important, that I believe in, that I know is right, and I don't, and that's why I don't get discouraged, because we're supposed to fight, and we're supposed to fight back, and I know, I mean, I'm going to die with my boots on, and that's what that's what I'm going to be doing. So I already know that. I know that every day that I get up is going to be a fist fight, and I've reconciled myself to that. I have an incredible wife, and I have incredible kids, and I feel very, very, and I have friends and partners who are with me on the, my law partner, Michael Baum from Baum Hedlund, and and many of the other attorneys who are working with us who understand what the stakes are. And then all of these incredible grassroots activists around the country who are, giving up a lot more than me. A lot of them are women who, are single mothers or who don't have, who have to bring children with them, show up at the rallies. And, those are the people who make big sacrifices.
Yep. And it's not easy, no matter who's in this fight at the end of the day. We're all trying our very best to make sure that we leave our world a better place for generations to come. And I'm sure that that's taxing on you emotionally as well. Is there something that keeps you up at night that is challenging for you? And then on the opposite side, what gives you hope for the future going forward?
I mean, the stuff that keeps me up are global warming, 5G. Right. Really scary. The power of the pharmaceutical companies to compel untested, zero liability vaccines and sickening an entire generation of kids. That keeps me awake at night. The stuff that makes me optimistic is seeing the grassroots activism, and also technology. We're at a celebration today at the Heirloom Festival that focuses on sustainable farming, and a lot of the no-till, and cover farming has the capacity that we now have. Has the capacity to solve global warming problems. To turn our soils into a sink for carbon and reverse global warming in just a very, very short time. So those are the kind of things that make me optimistic.
Well, that's really exciting, and I want to say thank you so much for being here today and sharing your wisdom with us all. As a young person, I'm so incredibly inspired by everything that you do, and everything that you've said gives me hope to continue fighting for a better world.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and I should add that it's people like you who I've known for a long time and watched you, and who are committed to informing the public and to having an actual free and independent press, which democracy can't survive without that. And the mainstream media is now owned mainly by the pharmaceutical companies, but also by the oil companies and the car companies. So, it's good to have somebody out there who's doing real journalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us. See you next time.